Good morning, everybody in the United States, and good day and good evening everywhere else in the world. My name is Richard Byrne. I'm the editor of the Wilson Quarterly, and I'd like to welcome you to our event today. The Wilson Quarterly, of course, is published by the Woodrow Wilson Center for International Center for Scholars. And in our last issue of the magazine, we explored historical memory in an issue themed The Ends of History. And one of the articles we published in the fall grappled with what we're about to speak about here today, the Spomenici, or monuments of the former Yugoslavia. Large-scale works of public art that commemorated events of World War II and the struggle for liberation from invasion and occupation of that nation by Nazi Germany and its allies. So in the Wilson Quarterly last issue, Serbian writer and editor Dusan Veličković took readers on a journey through the politics of the former Yugoslavia that created the conditions and the space for the creation of these visionary works. This art was contested, at times bitterly, in the former Yugoslavia, and its fate in the nationalist wars of the 1990s and early 2000s that fractured that nation was often not a happy one. Disrepair, graffiti, and even in some cases, demolition. And it should be noted, unlike many of the figurative political monuments of socialist realism that were created in many nations of Eastern and Central Europe, it's impossible to gather up the Spomenici of former Yugoslavia and collect them into so-called statue parks. They were designed to become part of the landscape, and their aspirations and execution are much greater and at a higher level than mere propaganda and personality cult. Indeed, their abstracted scale usually resists such narrow interpretations. So Dusan's essay was accompanied by superlative photographs taken and collected by our guest today. Donald Niebel is the creator of Spomenik Database, which is the first comprehensive website for aggregation and study of these extraordinary monuments. He's also the author of this book, Monument Database, which is published by Fuel Books. So I'd like to welcome you, Donald. Thanks for being here today. And I'd like to start just by asking you to describe briefly your personal journey with the Spomenici. How did you get interested, and how did you? I know many of our viewers are probably sharing both your and my fascination with Yugoslav culture, and it does become a labyrinth, and you fall in and really become passionate about it. So I guess take us a little bit through your personal journey.
Well, firstly, thanks so much for having me on today, Richard, and thanks to the Wilson Center for putting this all together for us. And I guess just to start, I mean, it's kind of a long story. I've been doing it for about 5 years, not more now. And it all began just, like many people back maybe 5 or 6, 7 years ago, they started in the US at least, probably even across a lot of Western Europe too, seeing the photographs of a photographer, Jan Kempeniers, who did kind of a really impressive collection of these monuments, taking photographs of them in the early 2010s and the early 2000s, which was really the first kind of instance of someone going around and cataloging these sites in their condition after the Yugoslav wars, and going to all the way from Macedonia to Slovenia and everywhere in between. And I saw these images, and it was they were just, to me, very baffling at first, because I could see them and obviously knew that they were some nature of monument. The Jan Kempeniers didn't always have a lot of context with his images, but I just wanted to know so much more, because I could just see by looking at them, they contain so much visual information, and I could feel like I was in touch with it, but it was just out of reach, being able to understand what it meant. And so, yeah, I just kind of set myself to trying to understand them the best I can. And I had several months between jobs. And so I spent about 3 months back in 2016 renting a car and trying to find as many as I could. And
Mm,
it was pretty difficult in the beginning because back at that point, there weren't any real maps or directions. And so the way I found them often was just getting Google satellite images and scouring through the landscape so I could hopefully see them. Thankfully, they leave pretty charismatic shadows on the landscape, and so that helped to be my guide. But also the people that I met along the way on my journey helped me to find these sites. You know, this is the monument to the revolution of the people of Moslavine in Podgorica, Croatia. And yeah, that was, I think this was the very first one that I visited. I rented my car in Zagreb and drove out into the countryside. And here we were. And since then, you know, I didn't have the immediate idea to make a database out of this or a website. It only came afterwards when I got home. I saw that I had all these pictures. I had gotten all these translations made of inscriptions by people I met along the way, learned these histories, and I thought, well, I might as well put all this information on a little corner of the internet. So if anyone else wants to go see them or learn about them in the way I did, they don't have to go through all of the time and travel and struggle that I did. So
mm.
as soon as I started to put this together, I immediately started getting messages from people, not just in the former Yugoslav region, but from around the world saying just how intrigued they were and fascinated, and encouraged me to do more and more. And so that's really what I've been doing since then.
Yeah. So I will sort of give people an idea of what we're looking at. And this, as you mentioned, is the Monument to the Revolution of the People of Moslavina, which was erected in 1967 in Podgorica, Croatia. And it was designed by Dusan Jamonja and Vladimir Velichkovic.
Yep.
So let's use this to talk a little bit about the information that's in these. You had mentioned that these were often monuments that are very visually arresting, and I'm sure we'll talk a little bit later about some of the other uses that to which they've been put commercially. But let's talk a little bit about this particular monument and what were your first impressions, and what impressions overall do these monuments kind of offer to you?
Well, I think the first thing I'd say is pictures rarely ever give justice to these works because they're on just such an immense scale that I think photography often fails to kind of capture just the grandeur of them. But in this instance here of Dusan Jamonja's monument, you can see it just as you has this very deliberate kind of procession up to it in this kind of gateway portal, and it's almost like it's looking at you with this sun sphere at the center that's winged. And at first, you know, it may seem very just a pure abstract sort of creation, but you know, it has within it a huge amount of kind of symbolic history that goes through many cultures and through the ages. And so it's an attempt to communicate, you know, the ideas of victory, of overcoming, you know, this sort of struggle that these people here in this part of Croatia underwent during World War II, and
Hmm.
also setting the monument not within some square of a city, but putting it in the spots where the events took place that are being commemorated in a way to kind of make it like a pilgrimage for
Mm,
people to connect with their own history. So not just reading about it in books, not just like seeing a monument in some square somewhere, but actually going and traveling and interfacing with a part of the culture and history and past events that, you know, that the government hoped would make people, you know, more kind of informed and patriotic citizens.
no. So that's a really great point to kind of push to uh a different transition. I will pull up. Oh yeah, so here we go. I'm sorry. I jumped ahead. So let's talk a little bit about the transition from the sort of the immediate aftermath of World War II into the creation of these monuments in the 50s in the
Mhm.
late 50s through the 1980s. So this is a statue of Marshal Tito, Josip Broz Tito. This was erected in 1977, though it is a copy of an earlier statue, uh, and it's in Velenje, Slovenia. It is one of the largest of these statues of Tito in the world, and it was sculpted by Antun Agustinicic. It's also mentioned specifically in Dusan Velichkovich's article. He made a pilgrimage to it as well. Um, and let's talk a little bit about, let's pick up from what you just said. This is a very large statue of Tito. It's in a square in Velenje. Um, Talk a little bit about Tito and how these and how sort of Yugoslav art of commemoration transitioned from this this you know, one would say this is a little bit more passionate socialist realism. It's got some, you know, warts and all, uh it quickly went out of vogue in former Yugoslavia, except for Tito.
Well, the first thing I would say is just to clarify, just for a little bit more context, is this monument here that we're seeing in Velenje. Originally, during the Yugoslav era, it was called Tito Velenje. It
Yep.
was one of the Tito towns, and this was an effort to kind of to mark Velenje as one of the Tito towns, none of which are named. All of the former Tito towns have changed their names since. But to your question, yeah, this was a very early statue. I think 1946, right after the war. August Incic's had actually even been kind of coming up with concepts and ideas of this statue even before World War II had ended. All the way back in Yayica, he'd coming up with some ideas for it, and so it was one of the very first attempts to commemorate the events of World War II, Tito specifically, and his role in it. And yeah, as you were saying, uh, it has this idea of the original socialist realism, you know, a la, you know, Soviet art, but with Yugoslavia falling out with the Soviet Union in 1948, it quickly came to be a change in artistic attitudes and tastes as far as what was the most appropriate way to commemorate these events and what is the most effective form of memorial, statuary, and monument building to kind of embody the uniquely Yugoslav perspective. And so, yeah, and so while a lot of the very early statues were this sort of figurative art, very much related to the socialist realist style, very quickly, by the end of the 1950s, some artists started experimenting with types of modernism, of abstract, of even surrealism, with artists like Dusan Jamonja, Vojan Bakic, Bogdan Bogdanovic, and it really evolved and kind of took it became almost a whole art style of its own in all of these sorts of various incarnations of it into something really special and unique that with just the massive output, you know, other countries, other communist countries of the mid-century, mid-20th century were also doing some abstract work, but no one even came close to the output and the variation of form and style and just imaginative sculpture that that Yugoslavia did.
Yeah, so I've switched our viewers to a view of the Garovica Memorial Park of the victims of fascist terror. This is very much near the in the latter stage of these commemorations. This is 1981. It's in Bihać, in the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and this was designed by a sculptor, by an architect and sculptor you just mentioned, Bogdan Bogdanovic. Um, and I think this is a really good opportunity to talk about how to talk a little more deeply about how these works live in their space. I mean, you can, this photograph is so terrific because you can see just where it's situated within a landscape. So can you talk a little bit more maybe about this memorial and the sorts of things that it is communicating by the late 80s, and perhaps even Bogdanovich a little bit?
Yeah, well, to start to talk about Bogdanovich, he was certainly one of the most, he was a very prolific monument builder. He was an architect from Belgrade and had a very, some would say, surrealistic approach to monument building, incorporating a lot of very, almost kind of like ancient art motifs and symbolism into his work, where he wanted to kind of feel as though that his work and it was timeless. It came from an era almost pre-civilization, and he very much enjoyed sometimes people looking at his work and mistaking it for something ancient. I
Hmm.
know, and we can talk later about the monument in Novi Travnik.
Yeah, we'll see that.
And that's one that I can tell an interesting story about that. But in the sense of the monument here at Bihać, we have these sort of like sentinel mourning women that are kind of there are about a dozen of them, I think, and all of them kind of walk over this hillside, which is the hillside around which many civilians were massacred during World War II. And you can see here on top of this hill in the space that is very much connected to the act itself, which, like I was saying before, was often an integral component to memorialization in Yugoslavia, as far as getting people connected to these sites in a really meaningful way. And the memorial themselves often very much integrated themselves into the landscape. It's not like you just built this monument in on top of a hill or in this specific spot. There were often instances where the sculpture and the monuments kind of melded into the landscape. You
Hmm.
would have they would just seamlessly fit as if they were part of it, almost in the sense of it being kind of like land art or something like that in many
Oh.
cases. It's something which Bogdanovich was almost a pioneer of before the idea of land art even existed. Bogdanovich was doing land art in
Hmm.
some of his sites, such as what is it, Krusevets in Serbia, and many others. And you could say this is an example of it too, because he has the forms interacting with the landscape.
Hmm.
They're kind of going up along the hill. They're going on the side of the hill, and it definitely feels like these are a group of mourning mothers of of survivors that are pacing, thinking, and
Hmm.
crying over their lost family and friends and loved ones. And you can even see on the topmost block these little tear shape kind
Hmm.
of motifs, which very much could be understood as tears from the mourners.
Yeah. I'm gonna switch over a little bit. I would to another monument that is in Montenegro. It's now this is the Freedom of Liberty Monument in Ulcinj, Montenegro. This again is another later creation, 1985. It was designed by Miodrag Zivkovic and Georgia Zlokovic. Um, and I'm hoping we can use this to sort of transition. Again, it's you see this memorial in space, but I'm interested in also talking a little bit more about your travels and um, these whether it's land art, whether it's a physical monument that is interacting in space. It's space is also not space is also moving um, in time. And I'm curious as to talking a little bit about your travels and a little bit about the local response. I mean, clearly, when you're looking for things that are not on maps, or you're asking directions, you're engaging with local populations that have particular attitudes or perhaps no attitude whatsoever um, to these monuments. So I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about that. and in particular, reflecting also on Bihać, which was another very contested territory in the Yugoslav wars of the 90s.
Well, I would say, as far as my interactions with the people as I travel, it was, I would say, largely positive.
Hmm.
On instances where I encountered people at these sites, which wasn't very often, because, like we were saying just a minute ago, many of them are extremely remote and take much effort to kind of get your way out there. But I remember one instance when I was in Draganac, Serbia, in the western part of the country. There was this site there, this mass grave that was being commemorated there with this monument that I was visiting, and it was right across from this house. And this gentleman came out who I think lived across the street from it, and he saw me there looking at it, and I guess he probably could notice I was a foreigner. Uh, and he came up to me and spoke very good English, and he said, I must explain to you why this is important. And he sat there and began to explain to me, completely unsolicited, what had happened at this site, who was buried here. And I was just very moved that, that someone would feel just like this unwavering need to kind of explain this thing, because I'm sure a lot of people will probably go by there and don't realize what it is, because
Hmm.
the sites at Draganac, they're not the most well-traveled sites, and you don't get many tourists out that way anyway. And so I'm sure he really wanted to kind of feel connected to his history by telling it to someone who he probably thought didn't know anything about it. And so
Hmm.
that's often the large experience that I found. I mean, obviously, sometimes I would get, less than welcoming sort of feelings from different areas that I went, but that was very seldom
No.
and few and far between. Largely, I found during my travels, it was people just doing everything they could to help me and to point me in the right direction. If I said, even in the broken sort of communication that I can do, people would explain to me, go this way, go that way, and just
Mhm.
I showed them pictures. And yeah, I know some people would say, that there's the potential for, um, bad interface there with some people over this contested history. Yes, that's certainly true in some instances, but for me, it hasn't been my experience.
No. Was there a sense, because hospitality is obviously a very big thing in
Yeah.
the
Oh,
the
yeah.
culture of the culture of that region. I guess I'm curious, did you ever get reaction of, why do you want to look at that?
Oh, yeah. Oh,
I mean,
yeah. I
I
mean,
found that to be like a recurring motif in my own travels. Like,
oh, yeah.
why are you interested in that?
When I would tell people what I was doing, they would always be helpful, but at the same time, I could never get them to understand why someone would travel thousands of miles from the United States to their teeny little village to see this. To them, it just made no sense to them, and they thought I
Hmm.
was often crazy. But at the same time, people in the U.S. also thought I was crazy for doing what I was doing too. So
No.
there was a little bit of everyone thinking I was crazy.
Okay. I'm going to push us to the Novi Travnik slide, which is the necropolis for the victims of fascism. It's also known as the monument on Smrika. This was 1975, a little bit early, and this is also in Novi Travnik, Bosnia Herzegovina. It is, as you mentioned, designed by Bogdan Bogdanovic. And yeah, let's talk about this. For me, this particular monument really does try and tap into the ancient history of Bosnia. It's making like a very explicit reference to that to the art of that period.
Well, what I'll tell you a funny anecdote that I've heard about this monument. I can't say whether it's true or not. I read it in a paper somewhere, but it sounds like it could be true. But anyway, so when Bogdan Bogdanovic was making this monument, he was installing these and getting them inside it, and had all this dirt around and everything. And up across the hill start coming, I think it was like some Austrian hikers or something like that, and they see Bogdanovic here on this big site, with these very charismatic forms, and these hikers come up to Bogdanovich and say, I had no idea that Etruscans were active in this area because they thought he was doing an excavation.
Mm,
And in the story, it says that Bogdan Bogdanovich took this as the best compliment that he could ever receive.
mm.
So
Yeah,
I thought that was quite an interesting story.
it's really, it is fascinating because, and I think maybe this is a good moment to talk a little bit about, um, I mean, you've read fairly widely in, not merely in what these, represent and reaction to them, but also architectural intention, the intention of these artists. And I'm curious, can you talk a little bit about, perhaps some interesting, like, his Bogdanovich taking that as a compliment, I think is perfect, right? Because he really is trying to be in touch with ancient culture in these, but bring it into our contemporary moment. What have you learned from delving into, what these artists were intending in these monuments?
Intending as far as what they were trying to communicate symbolically or visually.
And both, and also, and also their sort of process in the relationship they had between their process and the site that they were working on,
Yeah.
because some of these sculptors did, what, 20 different sites or different commemorations.
Oh yeah.
So
Well,
so
yeah.
making them individual, like, and you have that delicate balance of putting your own individual artistic stamp on it, obviously, but then being sensitive to the history, and also not really repeating yourself, to try
Yeah.
and figure out new ways of expression.
Well, I can say here at this site in Novi Travnik, this individual site is yet as many were sites to massacres. There was during World War II a massacre of civilians at this site, and you can see in these individual carved monoliths that you have this sort of a serpent form, and what you can't see is that the serpent continues around on both sides. It's like one long double-headed serpent,
Mm,
itself being a very ancient symbol. And the eyes kind of look out, each set of eyes is different, and they each look out in a very almost forlorn way, almost like they're staring into your soul.
mm,
And I think these are kind of these sort of monoliths are markers, kind of in their eyes telling you about the sadness that occurred here, while also perhaps being guardians of the site to watch over those that had suffered here and to guide them kind of into the next realm.
mhm,
Bogdanovich had this really interesting connection to wanting to communicate the passage from one life to the next. And you can see that in many of his monuments. And I think
yes.
this here's another example of that, of wanting to create through your artwork kind of non-religious symbolism to communicate the idea of passage of life, of commemorating fallen innocents and fighters in a non-religious way. And they did some really unique things. I mean, it was that constraint of
Mm,
not being able to use those traditional kind of religious motifs that often get used in the West to mark sadness and loss and
mhm,
death. And from this constraint, we get just the most magnificent and imaginative works of art that commemorate not just loss, but also signify the struggle against fascist forces,
mm,
and this overcoming of adversity. Like seeing, like if you look at the Zivkovic monument at Ulcine, that kind of has that pyramid,
mhm,
inverted pyramid. It almost looks like it's floating. That whole idea of overcoming gravity. Something that looks like it should fall by all rightful assumptions, but it stands nonetheless. That overcoming of adversity against all odds. That
yeah.
was one of the big symbols of Yugoslavia. This teeny little country, or this teeny little kind of region, was able to resist and fight back against, in a meaningful way, a force
Mm,
much greater than itself.
yeah. So I'm going to take us to one of the great sites of the struggle that you're talking about, which is, and I'll have two views of this, and I'll show the second one as we continue talking. This is the Battle of Sutjeska Memorial Monument Complex in the Valley of Heroes, and this was built in 1971. It was in Tentište, the Republika Srpska in Bosnia Herzegovina. This was designed by Miodrag Živković and Ranko Radović. And I also want to mention to viewers that Dusan Veličković does talk about this particular monument a bit in the essay. One of the things just to sum up, one useful thing that should spur our discussion is the history behind. There's a history behind this monument, obviously, which we can talk about, but the history of this event itself has become very contested, and in particular, Tito's role in this battle has shifted. Historians have shifted their view of it from a heroic Tito to a Tito that really basically was saved from a very difficult position by others who never quite got the credit for that. So I'm curious. Let's talk a little bit about this. I mean, it is one of the classics of this genre. And you can see it, the landscape itself, the form, that image of floating that you talked about with the Olsztyn monument is also here. So first, let's talk about the monument itself and guide us a little bit through what you know of the process of how it was created and
Well,
situated.
this monument commemorates the Battle of Sutjeska, which happened here in 1943 when this partisan army, the Central Committee with Tito, were all kind of trapped or were being kind of encircled on this mountain. And through the process of kind of like Tito and all of his commanders and the unit were trying to think, what should we do? We have to get out of this. And so they came up with this daring move to kind of like burst through this over this particular mountain, just go like straight up the side of a mountain to try to evade this circle that was tightly coming around them. And so this monument marks the point. Kind of, if you look at it the other way, it opens up into the steep draw in which they escape out of the valley from. And it almost is opening up like wings, like it's wings of victory in one sense, like the Samothrace wings, but in the other sense, it's like guiding you outwards and upwards to safety. And it's really unique in that sense, that it, in another sense of the monument, interacting with the environment upon which it was built. It's not simply just sat here, but it's sat in a specific place and it gestures in a specific direction in a very overt, deliberately calculated way, in such a way that it's so much more than just the monument itself. It would be less if it were put somewhere else. It only here doesn't have its full context and symbolic meaning. And then you have this kind of radiating courtyard in front of it, which opens up into the canyon in which they went out through. And the form itself, it has this kind of broken fractal form. And as you get to the center of it, you see these faces protruding out, no doubt symbolizing those soldiers that fell along the way, many thousands of which did.
Yeah. Do you so this, I mean, this was a very pivotal event in, Yugoslav history. There was even a movie made of it, right, with Richard Burton, I believe, was in the lead, and Tito, as with any, because I think Force 10 from Navarone was also filmed in former Yugoslavia, and there's always a lot of government interest in those films. Can you tell us a little bit about the process for this particular site, and we'll get to another very important site next, but the process for these seems are some of the most interesting parts of your website, I think, documents you've been able to collect and photos of process. And can you talk a little bit about this one in particular? It drew a very, very strong degree of interest from the government and how it was depicted and portrayed.
Oh yeah. I mean, I would say most of the monuments that were built were in Yugoslavia were largely local efforts. A lot of people had this idea that all of the monuments were built specifically by the government or maybe even Tito, and obviously that's not correct. Most of them were homegrown local efforts by communities and towns, but this effort is one of the efforts that was most indeed a largely government effort to create and memorialize this, the most probably the most meaningful and influential sort of event in the Yugoslav kind of World War II historical narrative. And so, of course, Tito was here on site during the construction many times. He was very much involved. You can see pictures of with Miodrag Živkovic with the model of the sculpture here, and Tito like thinking over it very, very intensely. So yeah, Tito was involved in every step of the process and visited this site many times. He had even what like a hunting lodge not too far from here, so he was
Hmm.
in this area quite often. And yeah, the process, if you see the pictures, they had this huge frame they built around the entire thing, and they did the concrete forms for each of these individual sort of panels. And you can still see the board forms on the sides of it, which
Hmm.
in many instances the board forms themselves add to the structure and the texture of it to give it
Hmm.
more kind of that radiance. But as far, one thing I still have not figured out for the life of me is what is the engineering going on here to keep this thing standing up.
Mm.
I don't know if there's some sort of counterweight built into the hillside or what, but to me, to this day, that still mystifies me as far as what is the engineering principles that keep this thing from falling down, even all of these decades later. So
Yeah.
yeah, to me, it's a continually fascinating site.
Can you talk a little bit about your visit and what I mean you've described this so well. What are your feelings? Again, this is one of the sort of three or four holy grail sites in this genre. What was your feeling just sort of, being able to wander around it?
Oh, I mean, it's like I said before, the photographs can't do it justice. I mean, and every time as you walk around it, it changes with the
Mm,
light, with the shadow, and with every perspective. It's like a completely new sculpture monument. Every angle you look at it from, which gives it unending appeal and interest. I think from anyone who appreciates art or history or sculpture,
mhm,
and just learning about the Battle of Sutjeska and what the people there had to endure. I mean, I can't even imagine. And so to have this be such an integral and poignant site for Yugoslav history is not surprising to me, because it could have been it was the be all end all moment essentially,
mhm,
because the Axis powers were doing everything they could to capture Tito, and they came very close in this instance. And if they had succeeded, I think history would have been very different in this
mhm.
region. So
Yep.
it's very interesting to think about how the symbolism of this monument kind of relates to the history, and this is a site where commemoration still occurs and where restoration efforts are ongoing. You can see just in this photo compared to the last photo, the monument's almost black in
Mm,
color. But the previous photo shows that it's been restored recently with some chemical cleaning to bring back its
mhm,
original white color. And that's also a very important thing to note too, as well as this hillside that it's built on is not a real hillside. They constructed this hillside so the monument could have
mhm,
perfect placement, perfect kind of symmetry and integration into the landscape to frame in the most ideal sense.
Hmm.
And so that's something a lot of people don't realize, that this hillside, this plateau that is constructed on, is not natural. It was built,
Yeah.
which unfortunately came into play a couple of years ago when, during heavy rains, a huge mass of the hillside sloughed off,
Yep.
threatening the monument. But thankfully, they fixed that over the recent years.
Yeah. So Sutjeska is a commemoration of one of the great victories or narrow escapes that turned into victory. Um, I'm going to show us a slide of the commemoration of a much grimmer, sadder place, which is Jasenovac, which is the notorious concentration camp of the Second World War. And my sharing is not working at the moment. Let me try. Let me try that again. But I'm curious. This also had a very fraught process in terms of its creation, and also I would argue that Duchan's article does also mention this very specifically. So as I'm trying to work technically here, can you talk a little bit about that process? And I guess let's start with Tito's involvement. Tito was also very much involved in that process as well. So here it is. This is the famous stone flower, the flower monument, also known as a stone flower, in Jasenovac, Croatia. It was completed in 1966, and again, it was Bogdanovic who designed it. So I guess
Yeah,
let's start and talk about Tito
yeah.
first.
Well, yeah, this most certainly was one of the most notorious concentration camps that existed on the soil of the former Yugoslav region during World War II. I mean, even the Nazis reported that they were horrified to learn what was going on here. So that kind of gives you an indication. And so this was a site that was commemoration started basically before the war even ended, with people putting little markers there and writing names. And so this was a site that was going to be commemorated. It just needed to be decided how it was going to be done. And obviously there were lots of sort of discussions within the government with such an incendiary site,
Hmm.
because this was a site where the Ustasha, this was not a Nazi-run concentration camp.
Yep.
This was run by the Ustasha, and so this was, how are we going to deal with this very sensitive topic of mass atrocity, of people on our own soil murdering other people on their own soil? So it was something where they started off thinking, there were lots of ideas, lots of different artists put forward ideas. I know Vanya Rajush had this idea of it being a big casket, and these stone casket and skeletal figures going around it. But some other people say maybe that's a bit too visceral, a little bit too kind of macabre. And people kind of thought maybe this should be something a little more for reconciliation. And so
Hmm.
an idea came to Bogdan Bogdanovic, and he put forward this idea of it being a kind of a flower, and he put forward these ideas, and Tito looked at them, and I think he said something to the effect of, if this architect wants to build something in the abstract form, we'll just let him do it. So I can't remember the exact phrasing, but it was, Tito saw the promise of Bogdanovic's idea,
Hmm.
and from there Bogdanovich created this flower of forgiveness, of reconciliation. And it's made of concrete board form, just like we saw before. You can even see the board form still.
Hmm.
And with this, it became an intense site of memory, of reconciliation, and of commemoration. I remember reading articles saying when it first opened, it was surrounded, like had this big gate keeping everybody back, and it was filled with these wailing women and mothers and people just in fraud, in thought of the place.
Hmm.
And when they opened the gates, people just flooded onto it. And you see these photos, and like people are literally covering the entire site. And
Hmm.
they're writings from Bogdanovich. He wasn't sure whether the site would be able to sustain that amount of people on it, because it certainly wasn't designed to hold hundreds of people on top of it. So it was just kind of an illustrate how significant of a site this was.
Yeah, and I think it is important to underscore something you just said. This was a more than 2 decade process in commemorating this site. So there was a lot of intentionality about doing it. I'm going to switch to a sort of a larger view that shows how it works in the landscape. Um, Again, what were your impressions, visiting it, and what could you gauge about its contemporary status, so to speak? I should also add, the first time I, I later visited the site, but the first time I did see it was from the road on a bus, so very much like this. So what is the yeah what's your sense of the contemporary status, and what's your assessment of the site today?
Well, the first thing I want to say is this is the approach that you do to the monument from the road. And this boardwalk that you take to it is made from railroad sleepers of the railroad that used to take boxcars of people to the concentration camp here. And as you see it, the monument reflected in this lake, you have to take note that this lake is not natural. Bogdanovich had this lake built, so on this approach, you could see the monument reflected in the lake to kind of it's again that symbolism of one life and the next life. You see the flower reflected up towards the sky, but you also see it reflected going down. So it's this connection between the land of the living and the land of the dead,
Hmm.
which I was saying before is a theme that Bogdanovich touches on again and again in his work. But as far as commemoration, yeah, I would say this is probably among the most kind of contested and sites in this region, and so much to the point when they do have commemorations at this site, they have to have three different ones consecutively throughout 3 days. They have one for the Croatian community, the ethnic Serb community, and also the Jewish community, just because there's so much kind of disagreements over the site and of how it's commemorated, about the
Hmm.
words that are used, about numbers that, yeah, as a result, it continues to be a contentious site to this day, and
Yeah.
also a misinterpreted site. Like I was talking to you about recently, a couple of years ago, they had an Australian sunglass company try to. They had this new line of sunglasses, and they decided, hey, we're going to use the Jasenovac memorial as the centerpiece of our marketing campaign for our new sunglasses.
Hmm.
And in their ignorance in doing so, they brought upon themselves significant condemnation from people, not just from Croatia, but from the Jewish community around the world. And obviously, they ended up pulling the campaign, but it just kind of goes to show how I don't think they were necessarily coming from a place of meanness or of hate.
Hmm.
I think it was largely just ignorance, and a lot of people continue to have ignorance about around these sites and not really understand what they mean. I mean, there's lots of ways to appreciate them,
Hmm.
more than just aesthetically, and I think in appreciating them aesthetically, it behooves oneself to understand the history as well.
Yeah. I want to dig just a tiny bit more into that, because so and I guess before before we move into the last part of our presentation today, um what what do you see as the tension between that sort of contextless aesthetic appreciation of these sites and just a very deep and often very bloody history, behind them. It is it's part of their. I think that part of these works' continuing interest is their, very abstracted, aspirational form that they take, and so much of what we've been talking about how they are in constant dialogue with their physical environment, and even had physical environments created in which to situate them. So I guess I would love for you to dig a little bit deeper into that gap between the aesthetic appeal and the history, because you've devoted so much time, and I urge everyone to look at your site, and the information and the context that you supply for your readers is immense.
Well, to start, I would say that today there are obviously lots of people that are interested and appreciate these monuments, yet understand very little about their history at the same time. And while there's room certainly for aesthetic appreciation, like I said before, it should be done, and almost it must be done in a sense of understanding as well what is being commemorated exactly. But at the same time, one must remember these are monuments that were built, you know, often with political ambitions in mind, and therefore that's also must be something, so you have two extremes. You have some that say these are just relics of oppressive communism, and another extreme that says, these are things that always must be remembered for their communist ideology, and
Hmm.
so we should remember them just for that. So I mean, obviously, there's a middle ground where you can understand them as monuments that often represent suffering, great loss, of tragedy, and while there are political aspects to them, this must be remembered. But I think dismissing them merely as communist propaganda is not giving them the justice that they deserve,
Hmm.
and it disrespects the people who died that they're commemorating.
Yeah.
And so I think that's always must be something to remember. But as far as their mass appeal, I think they speak in this language of universalism,
Yeah.
which is something that, Yugoslavia was a very multicultural country. It was not a country of one religion, of one ethnicity, of one culture. It had a uh, huge diverse community, and as a result, monuments were built to reflect this diversity, and spoke in a very universal language that it hoped could reach every aspect of this diverse country.
Yeah.
But as a result, their diverse language and their universalist message has gone far beyond what was originally intended, and is connecting to people around the world now who they were never initially intended for. But
Hmm.
with this kind of internet age and their proliferation on these kind of clickbait websites, people see them and they feel instantly drawn to them. They may not
Hmm.
know why
Right.
at first, but they'll just be this spark of something that'll draw them into it. And I think it's that universalist visual language, and as that is the thing that draws them in, I think from that as a starting point, there's so much more that can be learned, because I think the history of Yugoslavia is unfortunately, it's something that very few people around the world know about, as
Hmm.
far as its history and the lessons that can be learned from it as a historical legacy.
Yeah. So I've switched viewers to a monument that is also the cover of your book, which is the monument to the fallen soldiers of the Kosmai detachment. This is 1971 in the Kosmai Mountain Park in Serbia, and this is the work of Vojan Stojic. Um, and I think again, it's another image that speaks a bit to the universal language that you're talking about. Uh, I guess I do want to. We're unfortunately we're starting to run out of time, but I want to present one more image, which I chose as the cover of the article in the Wilson Quarterly, which is the monument to hanged patriots, also known as the Fork. Um, this was built sometime in the 1970s. You have not been able to determine exactly, I believe, when, in Vranskinievo, Montenegro, and this was designed by Milorad Misho Vukotic. And I guess to sort of wrap up our discussion, um, I would love to know where you're going next with both the website, and again, I want to mention your book, which is amazing. And if viewers really want to have these amazing images at hand, it's such a terrific work. So yeah, let's talk a little bit with me about where you're headed next.
Well, as far as where I'm headed next, I would say I'm continuing to develop the website every day, writing articles. I just wrote an article I published just a couple of days ago, cataloging about 50 memorial figurative statues that were lost during the 1990s and 2000s, that were either, torn down or destroyed. And I thought, and I'm continuing to do research into all these sorts of aspects of sculptural, historical, architectural legacy that often don't get written about very much. That especially outside the region, and especially in English, or in especially in accessible forms. There are a lot of people out there writing their papers, these academic papers, but often those are very hard to access. They're behind paywalls. You got to spend like $40 to look at one for 20 hours or something like that. And to most people, that's not reasonable. And I
Mhm.
think accessible information in the internet age should be the aim of anyone who wants to share their research and information. And for me, I like to work my very hardest to make the work that I do accessible to as many people as many people as possible, and in the easiest way. And as far as my future plans, I've been working with a student of architecture who's from Croatia originally, but she's working in Copenhagen now at a university. But me and her are looking to potentially do some nature of podcast where she wants to talk about these topics in a podcast, but in the language, in the local language.
Mhm.
So, because in my website is in English, and so obviously, just in that aspect, restricts the ability for many people who don't speak English, obviously, to understand it, and especially people in the region. And with a podcast that speaks about the topics in the local language, I think it's going to make the topic more accessible to
Mhm.
more people who might not otherwise have an opportunity to listen or learn about the topic. So that's something I'm excited about.
Yeah, it's like I said, I can't speak highly enough about your work. And like I said, I urge our readers to look at it. And if you do go to our latest Wilson Quarterly, what you'll find is that when you click on the images, you will be taken directly to Donald's site and have a full um, array of historical materials, other images, historical images at your fingertips, to really kind of look and place these monuments that are so extraordinary and are so visually appealing into their context. And I also I can't help but celebrate the fact that your work has been such a spur, I think, to scholarship on these monuments, and that it will now have this added factor of being of being in the language of the region is going to be terrific. So I want to thank you again for being with us, Donald. I want to thank our viewers for being with us today. Please have a look at the Wilson Quarterly. Um, our issue on historical memory is still our most current issue, and in 2 weeks we will be publishing our new issue, Back to the Future, that looks at whether the Biden administration will be able to simply resume various agreements that have been taken out of play in the last 4 years. Again, thank you so much, viewers, and have a great day.